Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Aga Więcek. I'm the Communications Project Officer at Kolof, and you're all very welcome this evening and the third and the last session of our first Wednesday spring series that we host under the title of Conflict Migration Through the Lens of Solidarity. And today at this last session this spring, we are going to talk about criminalization of humanitarians on European borders. Our panelists this evening are people who are humanitarian workers and volunteers working on the borders of Fortress Europe and whose work is really endangered at the moment with quite hostile policies against both humanitarian workers, but also against people who are seeking asylum in Europe. And I would like to use this opportunity and thank Niv, who is our host, and the Department of International Development at the University of Maynooth, who is the partner of this project, and also Concern Active, who is kindly supporting financially the series of First Wednesdays. And for those who don't know Kolof, we are the Irish Association of Development Workers and Volunteers, working in solidarity here in Ireland, but also with people in Global South. So now I will give voice to Niv, who will introduce our amazing panel to you. And once again, thank you very much for being here with us tonight for what we as an association of volunteers and international development workers see as a very important conversation and meeting, and something that we think should be highlighted, because the people that we work with, people who we represent, are being targeted by really hostile policies in Europe. So once again, you are all very welcome. Niv, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Aga. And it is great to be here this evening in the company of dedicated and experienced humanitarians for, as Aga said, the final event in the spring series. And like Aga also said, this evening we'll discuss the criminalization of humanitarians at the European borders. And while acknowledging that the use of some EU humanitarian funding is questionable, it's ironic that EU member states fund humanitarian action and support and engage with rights-focused humanitarian actors on the one hand, and yet subvert their legitimate work on the other hand, making their humanitarian work on Europe's borders increasingly threatened. And so to discuss these issues this evening, we're joined by a panel of migrant solidarity responders, Aideen Elliott, Mariusz Colton and Caoimhe Butcherley. So just to introduce them briefly, Aideen is Oxfam's Refugee and Migration Policy and Advocacy Coordinator, and Aideen has been active in solidarity movements in Ireland, Morocco, the UK and Greece. She completed her PhD on EU migration and asylum policy following anthropological fieldwork amongst policymakers in Brussels. And Aideen has published on the evolution of Ireland's refugee and migration policy in an EU context. And maybe Aideen can talk to us a little about policy during the evening. Mariusz is a Polish migrant and activist based in Scotland. And so since 2017, he has been active on Europe's external borders, mostly as an independent volunteer. So he also cooperates with small NGOs across Europe, including CHIO's Eastern Shore Response Team, where he helped people landing on the beaches in dinghies, with Action for Education as an official advisor, and with Assist, which is a legal aid organisation. Most of the time he works with refugees in Greek islands and Poland, but also in Bosnia and most recently Eastern Ukraine. And Mariusz believes that every person has a right to choose where they live and build their lives, just as he could when he moved to the UK. And he was recently arrested while providing humanitarian aid to refugees in the Polish-Belarusian border region. So he has direct and very recent experience of these issues that we'll discuss this evening. And last but not least, Caoimhe is an educator, a therapist, a human rights activist and filmmaker. And she has worked with refugee and undocumented communities for over 20 years, globally, including Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, Syria, Mexico, Haiti, and more recently, Ukraine. And Quiva is involved with trauma and resilience-informed psychosocial projects with specific emphasis on integrative, context-specific resources for humanitarian responders and search and rescue personnel in the central Mediterranean. And we are very humbled and very grateful to have you all here with us this evening. Thank you very much. So while most of us are generally aware of increasing numbers of migrants and the arduous journey they face in seeking safety, I often wonder if the general public are aware of the level of adversity both migrants and humanitarian workers face at Europe's borders. And in preparing for this event, I myself was shocked at some of the reported tactics that I encountered. And I continue to be shocked by reporting and testimony, no matter how often I encounter them, even though I lecture on humanitarian action and generally consider myself both resilient and well-informed. And recently, Sally Hayden made a call for the public to engage with these issues, to be informed as much as you can so that you can engage confidently and accurately in debates and actions at what she calls a pivotal time. So with that in mind, maybe I can come to you first, Mariusz. You have direct experience of some of these issues, and you've been active with Grupa Granica on the Polish-Belarusian and the Polish-Ukrainian border. So I'd like to ask you, what tactics have you witnessed border security use, and how did this treatment differ across the two regions or two migrant groups?
So basically, to start with, the entire region of Podlasie is full of armed people, police, border guards, army. There are multiple checkpoints on the roads, and basically another way of saying that if you're not white enough, you're gonna be stopped for sure. I'm not a blonde guy. When I'm sitting behind the driver, there's 100% stop, especially when I'm not shaved. So stop and search, and some people local to the area, they have it like 4 times a day since late September. The tactic they use is just basically trying to scare people away from the area. So-called closed zone is still active. Initially, it was just an emergency rights that they had, according to Polish constitution, to seal the 4 kilometers area close to the very border. But once that was finished, they kind of changed the law, which is not according to Polish constitution, cannot extend emergency for more than 6 or 3 months. I don't remember exactly, but still you cannot enter if you are not living there. The entire town of Białowieża is basically sealed. A lovely restaurant that was like quite a high end ended up selling kebabs to the soldiers because there's no tourists. And people are being literally hunted in the forest. I mean, like people crossing from Belarus, there's a manhunt there. And without even taking any kind of, they're not even hiding that, right? When I was in Bosnia, at least, I mean, like Croatians, that they were trying to say that we are not doing that, while Polish, they're doing it openly. So you can see like passing by, you can see people on their knees, like black people on their knees, being like guns being pointed at them and taken on the truck and driven in the direction of the Belarusian border. So it's basically, they treat that area like the occupiers' army, pretty much. So that's the Belarusian border. And Polish border, I was at the first 2 weeks of the war, I was on the border with Ukraine quite a lot. Then I started driving to Eastern Ukraine. So obviously it was more in Ukraine than on the actual border. But it was another picture. People were like border guards giving teddy bears to children, and soldiers helping me to load the van with the stuff and asking me to have a coffee break. Or like a border guard officer giving me like, shaking my hand and saying that I'm very brave, that I'm driving to Kyiv, and like that he's proud of me. And then 2 weeks later, the same border guard is just arresting me in Podlasie. So yeah, there was a much difference, like a big difference between those two borders. And I just wanted to stress that it's not necessarily Polish people being hypocrites. There's a lot of Polish people, even in Poland, they don't know what is happening in Podlasie, because the media, they lost interest after first month. And then, like, you know how it is, like people have different things in the news cycle to be interested in.
Okay, thank you very much, Mariusz. And so it sounds from what you say, you know, that the border guards are acting with impunity on the Polish-Belarusian border, and the complete opposite experience, you know, in the Ukrainian border. You know, horrific stuff. And Caoimhe, maybe you can add to that by sharing with us some of the key issues faced by both migrants and humanitarian workers on the ground at present that you've experienced or that you're aware of.
Thank you, Niamh, and all on the panel. I think the word that you drew out at the end of Mariusz's feedback is sort of the key one in this, in terms of impunity, systemic, institutional, policy-based, in terms of its impact, impunity. And a lot of what is being witnessed in terms of violence, pushbacks in the Balkans and elsewhere is also happening at sea, in the Aegean Sea, in the Central Med, by the EU's funding and direct, profound complicity in the human rights violations that are being committed by the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, by violent pushbacks by the Greek Coast Guards, Turkey's complicity as well in terms of using refuge seekers, asylum seekers as political pawns oftentimes. And that culture of impunity has intensified, particularly, I think a lot of us can attest to in the past few months, where a lot of the media's focus has been on Ukraine. And similar to Mariusz, I've been in Ukraine a couple of times recently with various different solidarity networks. And the profound contrast, I think, that we're all witnessing, vis-a-vis the humane, compassionate, rights-based, affirming response of those fleeing Ukraine, contrasted with the racialized, violence, the racialized borders, that have been enacting violence, against communities from a multiplicity of geographic origins, including Syria and Afghanistan, from Congo, Eritrea, Sudan, Central African Republic, and elsewhere, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, etc. But one example of that, and I say that both with relief in a way that there has been such a beautiful response, to Ukraine, but also with the profound dissonance of witnessing, that not being extended, and oftentimes, a direct contrast, a very violent contrast. But the last time that I was in Ukraine recently, we were working with a medical organization called Medical Volunteers International, who are also operative in Greece, and they work specifically oftentimes with undocumented communities. But while with a group there responding to the medical needs of Ukrainian families fleeing, we met a small group of young men from Sri Lanka, and they had been camped up at the border for almost 7 weeks, a lot of that through the winter in.
You've just muted there, Caoimhe.
Yay.
Okay.
But maybe that's a good signal also to wrap up. But yeah,
It's okay. You were saying they were at the border for 7 weeks.
Yeah, and while at the border, I just think it almost, for a lot of us, became a metaphor, for these two extremely different responses. A group of young men who were in Ukraine undocumented pre the war, and the huge effort. They only managed to eventually exit a few days ago, and that was with us pulling in, collectively, collaboratively, sort of every contact that we knew, every NGO, who we could sort of pull into a system of response for them. But it just feels like it's erratic, that sort of social capital involved in terms of, if you happen to meet somebody who happens to have a contact, who happens to be able to make that call, oftentimes there's a difference whether, people have their rights respected or not. And certainly, I think some of the stories that were told, particularly of the Belarusian border and that violence writ large, are accelerating, in sort of almost the cover of just externalized violence. So two keywords that come up for me are definitely cultures of impunity, and then the externalization of EU borders into the sea, into these sort of no person's land, through violent pushbacks, and people's rights being negated, daily with increasing levels of violence, and that criminalization now extending to those who respond.
Yeah, and just on like something linking some of that into what Mariusz just said about, about basically controlled zones at the borders where NGOs can't enter, where humanitarian workers can't enter. So there is no monitoring. There is, the ability to act with impunity is so much easier. Although it sounds like they do it regardless, Mariusz, from what you recounted. But it just makes it so much easier if there is nobody there to monitor, nobody there to witness.
And I'd say, and that is a segue in some ways to, I know what we're all going to explore today, but into the criminalization of witness. It's a criminalization of response. It's a criminalization of the few remaining assets at sea, the moonbird, etc. It is that monitoring presence that there is an attempt to silence, definitely. So it's the response work, but it's also the amplification of those stories of systemic human rights abuses as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Caoimhe. Aideen, just coming to you now. I mean, and this might sound quite naive, but you work for Oxfam, which is a globally recognised NGO, which you would think would offer some protection and legitimacy, for want of a better word, in the face of the type of challenges described by both Caoimhe and Mariusz. I'm guessing it doesn't necessarily make a difference. We're seeing the criminalisation of humanitarian work and pushbacks against migrants seeking refuge and safety, and harmful and unlawful attitudes and actions towards migration in general. Do you think, could you link all of this for us and talk to us a little bit about this in light of your research and experiences?
Yeah, thanks, Niamh. I do feel more protected. When I was on Sam, I was visiting the first of the closed camps that opened. So people might know that in Greece, the refugee camps are being replaced by closed, controlled access centres. So the way of addressing the humanitarian disaster that was those camps was to replace tents with containers, but they're prison-like, surrounded by 2 layers of barbed wire fence, and people are only allowed in and out at certain hours of the day. And you go through scanners like at the airport to go in or out. So, I mean, that's like criminalizing people who are just seeking refuge, because it's such a prison-like space to be in, to be received in. But I visited the first of those centres that opened, and I had applied for permission from the ministry, and I had it, and I was with 2 Greek lawyers. But when we took photographs of the camp from some distance, we were stopped by the police for half an hour. So there is those layers of kind of intimidation and dissuasion, as we've talked about, monitoring. So NGOs can't pass in and out of the camp like that. And, I met lawyers who said that it's easier for them to visit their clients in prison than it is in this camp. So how can we then monitor the human rights situation and ensure that people have access to the legal support to have a fair asylum process? So this, as you said, we can link all the different policy areas together in this bent on criminalization, which really stretches back to the very early EU level cooperation on refugee and asylum policy, when the Schengen area was formed and asylum was on the same kind of line as stopping drug trafficking and international crime. There wasn't so much differentiation made, and they were looked after by the same ministries and the same departments. So that mindset kind of can explain why there's not a preoccupation with ensuring the highest level of international protection, or ensuring solidarity sharing, given that 85% of displaced people are in the global south. There's a preoccupation with a criminalization. So it's kind of this surreal level where humanitarians are criminalized while pushbacks are happening, breaking international and EU law. So what's the EU response? Well, none of this could be happening, I think, in any of the member states that are engaging in this criminalization of humanitarianism and these pushbacks without some level of EU complicity, if not support. Yes, it's the Greek Coast Guard. However, they have EU support, and there isn't a robust monitoring mechanism. So at the moment, for the last 2 years, in September 2020, the EU member states have been negotiating a whole new approach in the new Migration and Asylum Pact. And that does include a border monitoring mechanism, but it's not strong enough at all. So a number of NGOs have made recommendations on how to make that more robust. But at the moment, pushbacks aren't being properly investigated. In March, the Greek government released an investigation into pushbacks in Greece, which found no evidence that pushbacks were taking place. So that's just not possible. The evidence is overwhelming. So we do need the EU to step up there to stop supporting this and to use all their tools to investigate pushbacks and to also kind of just change course, you know, as I said, from this criminalization exclusion course to offering proper international protection and taking their responsibility.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, you mentioned that EU complicity, you know, and you know, so we've this new migration and pact on migration and asylum policy. I mean, is it just going to be more of the same? And what do we do to, you know, before this is finalized, while this has been agreed, how can we put pressure on our politicians, you know, or our EU representatives to make sure that this doesn't happen? Because it sounds like we're just going to come up with yet another policy that basically, you know, sustains this impunity. So what do we do? Caoimhe, would you have any thoughts on that? Or
it's, yeah, no, I was reflecting as you were asking me that, Niamh, just because I think in a way, I think for a lot of us engaged in this, we almost feel a level of exhaustion is a wrong word, but I say even for those of us who entered into this work with a healthy dose of cynicism vis-a-vis policies, there's, I think, pretty endemic disillusionment with any of sort of the mechanisms, you know, particularly vis-a-vis campaign work, advocacy, you know, petitions, lobbying, you know, all of these sort of tried and tested mechanisms that we've tried to use in relation to other human rights struggles, you know, courting power, trying to ameliorate, you know, the harsh edges of policies that are, you know, really rooted in justice. And as Aideen was reflecting in terms of policies, it sort of brought to mind an image I remember when there was a standoff going on about 3 years ago, this August, or even 4, the COVID blur, between Open Arms or Proactiva, one of a Catalan and Spanish search and rescue operation or team, and the Italian Coast Guard. And at the time, Matteo Salvini, you know, was in position, and he, like many others, was espousing, you know, profoundly, you know, horrifically right-wing policies and discourse vis-a-vis those who were on board in that standoff. But at the time, you know, when a lot of us were focusing on the personality, you know, the very obnoxious personality that is and was Matteo Salvini, one sort of group sailed a sail ship, and on sort of the sails they wrote Matteo is, or Salvini is Brussels. And it was a really important reminder, in a way, that although we can look at, the individualized human rights violations vis-a-vis various border forces, this is being green-lighted. And it's being green-lighted, on an EU-wide basis, of which, for those of us who live in Ireland, Ireland is very much part and very much complicit in policies that are, translating into daily violations of people's rights to access international protection, to access lives of safety, of dignity, of meaning, of opportunity. And I think we have to loop this back as well, I think to something that was in Mariusz's biography that was written out at the end, in the sense of freedom of movement, of who lives here belongs here, of the right, to really question and challenge the validity of systems of borders, of systems of national policies that oftentimes are in direct violation of international humanitarian law, in direct violation of the Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol, are in direct violation, of mechanisms and pieces of legislation that were created in the aftermath, specifically of the Second World War, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, in the aftermath of people who were fleeing the Holocaust being able to access international protection. And within all of this, I'm reminded, again, when I think of the sort of the role of responders and that criminalization of response and of witness, but of I'm thinking here the Nuremberg Conventions. I'm thinking of violations of of national law in the hope of upholding international law. And even if we remove law from this framework, of morality, of humanity, of compassion, of empathy, of solidarity, of justice, of rights. So when we witness that criminalization of people on the move, the violent negation of their rights, the separations of families, people dying of hypothermic shock in forests in the Balkans, people, tens of thousands of people drowning, preventable deaths in the Central Med, people hiding in forests, people dying, under the backs of lorries trying to pass from Calais, people dying in dinghies. The direct, lived practical translation of these policies being made in Brussels are death. They're the deaths, of countless people, today, tomorrow, next week, the week after that, and it is getting worse. So I was recently, and I'll draw to a close with this, but I was recently in Greece for the trial of Sean Binder and Sarah Mardini, and the over 23 other humanitarians, many of them medics, lawyers, activists, cooks, people who had gone to Lesbos to cook soup and, hand out blankets to people coming off of dinghies. But the trial itself was Kafkaesque. It was just so bizarre. It was so replete with contradictions and inadequacies and injustice. So although I think that word that I used to begin with, sort of a disillusionment or an exhaustion with using these mechanisms, I know we have to keep on using them. I know we have to keep on lobbying and campaigning and writing the reports and signing the petitions, and trying to impact systemic political change. But I also think, it really needs, a much wider mass movement of people translating, even an iota of some of the empathy that has been shown vis-a-vis, people, oftentimes profoundly brave people fleeing Ukraine, with profoundly brave people fleeing a multitude of contexts. And within that, I think, to also not fall into, and I'm conscious of our brilliant comrade Renit on this session as well, but not falling into these sort of dichotomies of, sort of fetishized resilience or endurance or overemphasis on vulnerability, but to are complex, and people are amazing, and that people deserve, rights.
You're frozen there again for a second, Quiva.
No problem. Anyways, that was a long-winded way to say, that people deserve rights and justice and freedom, in all of the different meanings of that word.
Yeah, completely agreed. Marius, Caoimhe just mentioned there, Sean Binder and the others that were arrested with him, and their court case and the adjournment and all that. And I mean, the criminalization of human rights activists, some of the charges, like espionage, membership of illegal organization or criminal organizations, facilitating irregular stay of people. Just in terms of, you've been arrested recently in the course of your work, and given the legal sensitivities, we won't talk about the specifics, but I do wonder how you were treated following your arrest and how the charge and legal action is affecting your life in general.
So basically, one thing that I wanted to mention, you don't have to even be a member of the EU to be openly participating in what is happening. British soldiers have seen them personally helping to repair the border fence in Poland, right? And they are officially very not pro-EU. But if it comes for pushing innocent people out of the EU, Boris Johnson was first to send his soldiers to Poland. I've seen Estonians there as well. I don't have any proof that they've been participating in the pushbacks, but they were actively helping by repairing the fence cut by Belarusians, who are then using people to exactly as Turkey is doing, for political gains. So I guess being European means that your government is probably supporting that, no matter if you're Norwegian or British or EU citizen. And going to your question, well, basically, I was arrested for facilitating illegal crossing of European borders. Funnily enough, I was stopped a few kilometers from Belarusian border, but the charges are for organizing a trip to Germany. That's the logic. And yeah, I've been treated like I wasn't arrested by the police. I was arrested by the border guards because basically, according to Polish law, in the zone close to the border, in a peacetime, they have same prerogatives as the police, so they can stop and arrest you. And I wasn't even in that so-called closed zone. So basically, I was kept for 3 nights in the border guard station in a cell, but I was with a guy who was arrested with me together. That was really made a difference that we could talk. We were treated like it was a decent treatment. Like you hear about, especially Polish police, there every year people dying in Polish police custody. That's the rest of Europe is not talking about it, but that's the reality. We're not treated bad, but I got the impression that like doing decent things or things that are your basic human rights, like letting you go to the toilets, that they were so proud of it. Like, you see, it's not that bad. We are not the monster. We're letting you go to the toilet, or like, I give you a cigarette because you're out of cigarettes. Like, and I was like, yeah, guys, but that's something that you meant to do. It's not something extra that you're doing for me. So yeah, it was first few hours after the arrest, there was 2 guys in my cell trying to force me to unblock my phone. Basically playing like bad cops from the very, very bad Hollywood movie. Was actually kind of scary at the beginning, but after a few minutes, they were actually kind of funny because they were overacting the act, and it was just funny. In general, like, I would say I feel that I was lucky that I was arrested by them, not by the standard cops. But from the other hand, no information whatsoever about how long I'm going to be there, because according to Polish law, you could be basically first 48 hours they can keep you without giving you any information. Then the additional night was for the court that decided to deal with our case, because they wanted temporary arrest for 3 months to deal next morning, so we had to spend another night in there. And like, got a phone call to my lawyer from a phone that was given by the border guards, probably recorded. So also, yeah, it was like a lot of small things that you'd think like as Polish citizen that you have some rights. It wasn't downward like compared to what they do to people on the move. Like, you know, I was in the hotel, right? But it's still kind of very stressful. And the most stressful thing for me was being in that court. They were transporting us with handcuffs, all armed, and I kind of like not easily scared. But the scary thing was actually that 3 months that they wanted to put us into temporary arrest because they wanted to jail us in the city of Białystok, which is quite famous for a right-wing scene. And being in jail with those guys for what I was arrested for was a scary thought. It's not even the actual police or guards. It was just the idea of being jailed with a lot of right-wing guys in the same cell was scary. Then prosecutor office appealed. So they wanted us, because the first instance court freed us. They said for doing what we do, we deserve prize, not prison. It was very brave for the judge, especially in smaller places in Poland. There's a lot of political pressure on them to kind of do what government expects, and there's that ongoing thing with Polish government and the EU over the freedom of the justice system in Poland. So it was very brave of that judge to do that. And then the next hearing was, if I remember correctly, 3 weeks later. So I went to Eastern Ukraine just in case. It's just like 25 kilometers from the front line, happy that I'm there, not in Poland. That's what it does with your mind, pretty much. I could hear Kalashnikovs in the distance, but I was happy to be there, not in Poland, waiting for the second court. But they said also the same thing, like that we did nothing wrong and there's no reason to jail us for 3 months. And basically, prosecutor office would need much more evidence for temporary arrest than just what they had for that moment. So yeah, I mean, it's even if you think that you're tough, it's a scary thing. Like 3 nights in a cell in the basement and hearing sometimes your friends outside shouting words of solidarity and them being pushed and you know, like violence being used against them, and you could see it from your window. And then waiting for the temporary arrest appeal, and you try to do your work, but like I couldn't do it for a while in the region of Podlasie, not even because I was scared, or if I'd be arrested again, that would be not looking good in my case. But anyone who goes to the forest with me and is stopped with me is kind of basically in danger of being kind of glued to my case, and it's still the thing. And it's kind of like I had to switch to Ukraine for a while. So as long as this was ongoing, now I really don't know if it's gonna stand in the court, if I'm going to have a trial or not. It might be next 2 years with, like, you know, not knowing what's happening. Actually, last week I was in the forest in the night, and my main thought was like actually for a person that was with me, because I can still kind of feel that, like, if I'm arrested again, whoever is with me, they're part of that illegal organization or ring of smugglers. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
it's kind of playing mental tricks on you. And I was directly asked by border guards in kind of unofficial conversation on the corridor in the court if I could make a post to discourage others to follow. And I said, like, so you're asking me to post on Facebook not to do that, so then people are not arrested? And he said, yeah, because what you did was stupid. You are now in a shitty situation. I was like,
yeah. I mean, it's the intimidation and violence, you know, that's been directed towards humanitarian responders is incredible. You know, and it comes back to what we talked about earlier, you know, about impunity. you know, and it seems to me it's a prevention tactic, but it's also intended to intimidate and scare and prevent people from doing what you're doing, which is upholding rights, which is upholding the law, which is, you know, protecting people's right to seek refuge and safety. It just seems to be incredible, you know, when you think about it, it's 2022, and this is what we're faced with in 2022. When you're trying to help somebody.
One thing I forgot to ask, but according to Polish Penal Code, not providing help to someone in distress is a criminal offense. Right? So basically, I was helping people who were 3 days with children in the forest with no food and water. So passing by, according to my understanding of Polish Penal Code, is a crime, not helping them.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks very much, Mariusz, for sharing that. And I'm really sorry that you've experienced that. You know, I personally, I would find a Lumen court case very stressful, and that sense of being in limbo and not knowing when that you know, that trial will be, or that court case will be, and if it will go ahead, I'd find that very stressful. Caoimhe and Aideen, have you, either of you, ever been threatened, intimidated, or arrested in the course of your migrant solidarity work? And I'm wondering, how did that affect the work that you do and those that you work with? Because as Mariusz said, you know, there's that fear of, you've been arrested once, those that you're working with, how will it affect them if you're arrested again? Or does it prevent people? Is their tactic working, basically? Is it preventing people from responding? Aideen, or you mentioned.
I'm in Greece at the moment, and I think there's still quite a steady flow of people coming. Mariusz and Caoimhe, you've probably both experienced this, that then people make these connections, and maybe they return home from Greece and they tell people who they know about the experiences of the people on the move who they've met, and then they inform their wider communities, or they are really motivated to start solidarity movements in their own communities. So there's this kind of diffusion of information about people's experiences then vis-a-vis, like via that, people coming here to volunteer or to be in solidarity. And then there's also this can be really quite lovely network of emotional support, even if it's via WhatsApp, when people go back to Belgium or Poland or Germany or wherever they're from, but they continue to be in touch with the people who they met in Greece, and they have WhatsApp groups and they talk to each other, and it's this kind of solidarity support from afar, and then people often return. So yeah, that's nice that hasn't been impacted so much, because I think that's part of, and hopefully part of, building the mass movement that we need at the moment that Caoimhe mentioned.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's comforting to hear that, you know, that solidarity and that support, that mutual support is there and is strong. And it's something that I think will always be strong. You know, it's what motivates people to respond in the way they do, to do the work that you do, Mariusz, and you, Caoimhe, and you, Aideen. You know, people are motivated by that sense of empathy and justice and rights. And that's something that's very hard to tear down, regardless of the tactics, the intimidation that's used. But at the same time, it's very, very hard to continue and to stay focused and to stay committed when you're under such intimidation and threat of violence. I mean, you do a lot of psychosocial work, Caoimhe, and with migrants themselves, but also with responders. How do you deal with that? How do people cope and keep going?
It's a really good question, and I'm really grateful too that Aideen, I think, brought in that frame of that sort of peer-to-peer support. And you know, I think a lot of the love, you know, that fuels this work, both love of justice, love of solidarity, but also, yeah, there's a lot of, I think, warmth and empathy, within it, to each other. But it, yeah, and I think that is an amazing resource, and I think it really depends on the level of sort of criminalization that people are facing as well. I know, ironically, I was thinking in response to your initial question, I was detained years ago at the very sort of beginning of the numbers of people seeking refuge in Greece sort of increasing in 2014, and quite violently, actually, by a number of police sort of body slammed against a wall. And yeah, just, yeah, an unnecessary amount of force for what they were trying to do. But one of the people who witnessed that back in 2014, a friend from MSF, is now on trial, facing much more serious charges. And what I've certainly witnessed, with the people involved, to varying different degrees in the trial that I mentioned in Lesbos, but also, the over 150 people facing active charges of criminalization across the EU simultaneously. That number goes up and down. Is that, as you rightly spotlighted, Niamh, it's the limbo, that I think is the hardest. So for people who go through this process and there's sort of an end point, I think its impacts are maybe carried a little bit differently to those, that I'm in regular contact with, for whom this has been dragging on for years, because it has real lived impacts on their lives in terms of mobility, in terms of travel. In the case of Sean Binder, in the sense of his right to qualify for the bar in Britain, he's gone on to study human rights law with sort of a specialization in criminalization of humanitarian response, which he is so well equipped and situated to speak of and to. I know in the case of Sara, Mardini, her ability to do the solidarity work that she did with such deep commitment, has been violently stopped. The community, her place of residence in Greece, etc., sort of literally pulled out from underneath her feet in this dizzying turn of events. And for those who aren't familiar with Sara, she was one of the two Syrian professional swimmers who were sort of feted and celebrated. I think it was back in 2016 when her and her sister Yusra jumped overboard to help pull the dinghy that they were in, which was in distress or in peril, to safety, and potentially save the lives of those who were in that dinghy. And they went from being two very young women who were celebrated and invited to do sort of TED Talks, and her sister Yusra went on to compete in the Olympic team in Brazil and then elsewhere. But they went from that, or at least Sara went from that, to being arrested, being criminalized for her work, spending months in prison, and now not even being allowed to attend her own trial in Greece, not being able to defend herself. So the impacts that I've definitely seen, have been that sense of, yes, profound community solidarity, peer-to-peer support, real community around this. And then a lot of isolation, so people, once that sort of flurry of cohesion, or, sort of dissipates a little bit around, a trial or around a demonstration or sort of a key moment of expression of people really standing with them, then going back into, the lived reality for many of those, who are still living in Greece, of knowing, that they're being surveyed, of that consciousness of having phones tapped, of trying to wipe any incriminating details. And by incriminating, I mean just literally the contacts of people who are presently seeking refuge, families who are fleeing war, precarity, conflicts, the violence of poverty, climate change, etc. but just being so conscious. And I thought it very poignant as you were speaking, Mariusz, to think of, I've heard similar accounts to so many other friends who have been criminalized, of being so conscious of guilt by association, vis-a-vis other activists or solidarity responders or medics or social workers or educators, and the potential even harsher repercussions on those that they're trying to walk in solidarity with. So on a psychosocial level, a lot of, actually through CoLab, we've been working on for the last few years has been trying to respond to the very specific, quite unique context of solidarity response to forced and other types of migration, with a focus on secondary trauma, on resilience, but also vulnerability, on recurrent repetitive sort of memory, on the impact of the autonomic nervous system of always being on. And I've seen this in so many cases, particularly with younger folks. And it's not to say, by any means to bring in an ageist discourse, because I think the vast majority of solidarity responders these days in Greece are really young and really amazing. But that thing of, walking home from a camp at 2 a.m. and seeing, people sort of their faces, lit up by their laptop screens, 2:30 a.m., at the one cafe that still has internet connection, that's still open, the WhatsApp messages, that constant sort of barrage of needing to respond, to crisis. And it's in the vacuum of governmental response, the vacuum, of systemic policy-based, rights-rooted response, that the onus of responsibility is carried by volunteers. And that has impact long-term. And I think that is increasingly being shown by the levels of cyclical burnout, I think that we've all witnessed. So yeah, we need to better respond to that, and to carry all of those beautiful, I think, just affirmative aspects that Aideen spoke to, with recognition of the toll as well, and to try and mitigate against that toll, by really supporting people, on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. And just as you've brought us back to, it's the systems, the structures, the policies that sustain this situation. And I suppose, Aideen, like Fortress Europe is a term that's been long used to describe this European project. And, what needs to happen, with the new Pact on Migration and Asylum? What are the key things that need to change? What are the key things that need to be focused on?
So I think, like,
it's a big question, sorry.
Well, before getting into specific exact policies, just to pick up on that idea of the mass movement that Kriva mentioned, or as Mariusz mentioned, the huge numbers of people in Poland who are showing solidarity, that there are so many people who want this to change and who don't want to live in a fortress Europe. And I know in her intervention in last month, Sally Hayden, when she spoke at this CoLab event, said that when she was in Brussels, interviewing the people responsible for these policies, they said, we're doing this because this is what Europeans want. And that's also what I was told in Brussels. And I was in Leinster House last week and the week before, and there I was told that what really counts is being contacted by constituents and letters from constituents, and that gets things on the agenda. So we need to change the narrative, or make it known, because they're doing this in our name. So if this isn't what we want, then we need to be very loud about that, and very numerous. So then what needs to change is the overall approach, because all of this is done to not have people come here. So like, whether it's just not accepting, I suppose what Mariusz has said in his biography, that that people deserve to choose where they want to live. And that's especially poignant in an EU context, where one of the richest regions in the world hosts so few displaced people. So to shift from deterring people from coming here to accepting and stepping up to responsibilities. And they're even quite explicit in wanting to deter people, like the Greek Minister for Migration has said that these new types of camps are built as a deterrent, has said that they don't want to become an entry point for Afghans again. So this is all done quite intentionally to discourage people from coming here. So I think what needs to happen is to change that approach. And also then countries like Ireland need to take responsibility, because if there's kind of, we're geographically far away as an entry point, so we can hide behind that, but that's not good enough. We are an EU member state, and we do need to welcome and host people as well. So this, you know, when Mariusz was describing the difference of the different Polish borders and approach, some people might have heard the Commissioner for Migration, Ylva Johansson, when she was announcing the temporary protection directive measures for Ukrainians, which is great. She said that being at the borders, the Polish border, made her proud to be European. And it shouldn't be that there's only some borders at which she could say she's proud to be European, and when other borders are deeply violent. But what this has shown us is what can happen, actually, that all of these things that we were told were logistic impossibilities, that we were dreaming for even asking for them in 2015, have happened. So in that way, it is a pivotal moment. We can see what happens when EU leaders want to do it, they can. So then we need to keep that going and keep that momentum going, because we can't have this kind of really racialized two-tier system that Mariusz and Quiva described so well this evening. So that means that countries like Ireland need to relocate asylum seekers from countries that have more people arriving, and that we need to take responsibility for how they're received. And remember that the new closed facilities in Greece are 100% EU funded. So while Ireland can say, we're not really that involved because we're not in the Schengen area, we are involved as an EU member state. So we need to step up and use our voice at EU level to call for monitoring the conditions in those camps. And then we also need to play a part in a border monitoring mechanism, so that rights are upheld at the borders, and that pushbacks are investigated properly. So responsibility sharing and accountability to address this impunity that's been described this evening. I think there's some policies that we need to change.
Thanks, Aidan. I'm getting a message. My internet connection is unstable. I'm not sure if it's mine or somebody else's. Moment of panic there. I'm hoping it's somebody else's. I apologise if it's acting up. You know, just completely agree with everything you said there, Aidan. And I think, you know, for me, one of the biggest things, you know, is education and raising awareness. You know, this whole idea of, well, it's EU policy, it's nothing to do with us, and how have I any impact on that, and what's it got to do with me? It's taxpayers' money that's funding the EU. It's taxpayers' money that's funding the Libyan Coast Guard, that's funding closed camps in Greece. So it is everybody's responsibility. You know, to do nothing is to stand on the side of the oppressor. There's not a truer word ever said. I'm just having a look here. I think everybody's a bit shy this evening, folks, our audience at home. I don't see any questions in the chat. So I'm going to ask our panelists one more question. And while I do that, maybe if you have any questions or comments that you would like to pose to our panelists while we have them here, pop them into the chat there. But in the meantime, I suppose I'll ask a final question, and we'll come back to final questions if anybody posts anything into the chat. So I suppose, like, you know, it's that question about what you can do. So not everyone can or should be physically active on border areas or in camps. So how can people act in solidarity with migrants in a meaningful way? So what can organisations like COLOF do, and what can people acting as individual active citizens do? Quiva, do you want to come in on that?
Sure. I think, I mean, I was conscious actually just when I was speaking before, because I was referring so much to what is going wrong, of not spotlighting enough sort of what is going right. And I just wanted to sort of, in a way, pay homage to, I think, a lot of what we've also witnessed, as well as securitized borders and human rights violations, but certainly oftentimes, on a community level, and I'm conscious here, I'm thinking of those who respond, not just vis-a-vis the volunteers and sort of solidarity networks that I mentioned, the medical response, etc., or that we all mentioned, but also, people in the villages and communities, oftentimes where those seeking refuge are passing through. Because I think the sort of the nationalist or right-wing discourses, or that sort of externalization of it just seeming a little bit too far removed, and people not really being, directly sort of gripped into people's stories of survival. When people are witness, as they are oftentimes on the Greek islands or in the Balkans, or people who live in rural contexts. I definitely saw this around 2015-16 when people were crossing from Serbia into Croatia. Oftentimes it was local farmers who would come and respond, with freshly pressed apple cider, or, with little first aid kits, to try and bandage the feet of, particularly of children who've been walking, oftentimes having outgrown their shoes because they've been on the road for so many months, and, their feet were bleeding or weeping, and they were in pain. And I've seen, and I'm sure we've all seen, so much of that. There is so much latent solidarity. The Greek grandmothers, in Lesbos, knitting, sort of warm clothes for children and cooking the pots of soup, and the fisher people, the people who are on, in a way, in Lampedusa. So for all of those stories of sort of a shift to the right in certain places, there's also been a very deep, consistent stream of solidarity. And certainly, I think, in an Irish context, that was witnessed perhaps to a lesser degree, but nonetheless, it was there recently around Afghanistan, and the outpouring of public pressure in terms of trying to up the numbers of those being relocated here. It was definitely seen around Ukraine. And although it is, and has been a two-tiered, very racialized response on a policy level, I think on a community level, it has opened up, avenues and sort of places of solidarity outside of sort of the usual suspects, in a way, outside of those who have been engaged, for decades or for years or for months in solidarity. And I really think there's possibility and potential to draw that wider, to draw that frame of and lens of understanding of forced and other types of migration much wider. And to really try and, bring in a discourse of rights, justice, and a political understanding, of the injustice, of the legacies of colonialism, of everything, that fuels oftentimes migration, of conflict, war, etc. So I'd say, in a way, it's really reminding people to keep, a consciousness of the global context, but to focus locally. There's been so many, great examples of community sponsorship around Ireland, in the past couple of years, of small but impactful local initiatives. And I think whenever that surge of sort of empathy and solidarity arises, whether it's vis-a-vis Ukraine, Afghanistan, Syria, etc., to constantly remind people to focus on direct provision in Ireland. And for and to that, we have, the leadership, the compass, and the trailblazing example of the movement of asylum seekers in Ireland, of Massey, for those from abroad who aren't familiar with their amazing work, activism, advocacy, and really impactful change. But direct provision still exists, and that call for the abolition of a system that has fundamentally negated and degraded people's rights in Ireland for decades now has to be translated into, systemic policy change and action to end it. So I'd say just really trying to fuel those local iterations, and then help to sort of build some cohesion around a wider understanding and frame and discourse and practice.
Okay, thank you very much, Caoimhe. And there's a few questions coming in the chat now. So I think, Mariusz, we've one here that maybe you can respond to. So one is one of the questions is, there has been a lot of talk about the difficulties faced by volunteers and about the need to change migration policies. I wonder, however, what is the reaction by refugees on the ground to you as volunteer helpers?
So basically, the most common reaction is at the first moment when you meet someone in the forest is fear. Pretty much people are scared that you're going to call the cops, that you're going to call the border guards. And then there's relief. And I'm not talking about people who suffer, I don't know, hypothermia or are in need of medical assistance, because that's a different story. But many people cried from kind of temporary feeling that someone is smiling to them and kind of giving them essentials. There's also a lot of trust put in you that you're going to help them further, that you're going to solve the problem, they're gonna lead them to a safe place, which is unfortunately not something that I'm able to do in the forest 2 kilometers from Belarusian border. So it was oftentimes disappointment as well. And it's kind of sometimes heartbreaking saying, no, my friend, I'm sorry, but that's maximum of what I can do for you at the moment. It's just providing you with food and warm jacket, and it's -5 and the night, and I'm going to leave you alone in that forest. It's just, it's very complex actually how people do react, but most of the reactions are really heartbreaking in a positive way, because that's something that not many people know or talk about, but the treatment of Belarusian soldiers and special forces, it's really bad. Stories of physical violence, rape, stealing, extortion, everything. And when they cross to Poland, Polish soldiers shout at them, point guns at them, and push them back over the fence. So if you're the first guy or girl to show them any minimum compassion, that reaction can be different, but it's always very, very heartbreaking. And I think in terms of like the bigger, what was mentioned before, like most of the good work in Podlasie region, the borders Belarus, is done by the local people. Say majority of it now. I know some people who basically have a full-time job at the day and go to the forest at night, and it's 9 months already, and they're exhausted and tired and are being stopped by the cops. And most of these cops are not even local cops. They are from big cities in Poland who don't know the area, who act like being, somewhere else. And it's very diverse region culturally. Most of Poland is Catholic, but region of Podlasie is Orthodox mostly. So these people are kind of used to that, like my neighbor doesn't exactly share my faith and it's still a person. So yeah, I think the reaction of locals is also something that I'm going to remember. It's like I came for 2 weeks in October in the States until like very recently. First because I really felt I'm needed for the people on the move, but also that I'm very needed by the locals, so they have some, I don't know, respite that they could, sleep at night. And I think what could be done, like in broader European complex, is the focus on the local people. How is it affecting the communities? I've seen it in Greece when people were scared of the income from tourism, because tourists not coming to Chios, where I was mostly working. And now the same thing is repeating in Podlasie. So Białowieża forest, which is a national park, and it's being devastated. Like they built a wall inside of the really old, beautiful forest national park. They completely destroyed by trucks. And it's not only like a heritage of Poland or Europe, it's the most beautiful place in Europe, I think. But also that's a source of life for people who are there, all the tourism and everything. So yeah, that's very complex, but hard to kind of answer short.
Yeah, it's a very complex very complex situation. But yeah, the impact on local communities is another, a whole other issue that we could go into. Sorry, Caoimhe, you wanted to say something there.
I might just add to that, because I'm just wondering, I think there's layers in which to understand that question. But that I think we've all witnessed, I'm sure Aideen can attest to this too in Greece, but we've all witnessed, problematic practices vis-a-vis volunteers and sort of solidarity responders over the years. So in a way, by speaking to the criminalization, it's not trying to sort of lionize or romanticize that engagement. It's complex, it has contradictions. Certainly, at its inception, I think, from 2014-15 for the first few years, I think we've all witnessed very savioresque, sort of, just white privileged without any deconstruction or recognition of that, responses. However, I'd say I've personally witnessed a real sort of quite steady learning curve amongst people, because, the stakes are so high, and the context so brutal, that space, for work that was once celebrated and perhaps gained people some, modicum of sort of social capital or, sort of media profile, etc. The current has definitely turned against that, in the sense of it being, criminalized in certain contexts. So it's not to say that it doesn't hold contradictions, that it doesn't hold problematic dynamics at times. But I've certainly personally witnessed, I think, a steady learning curve for a lot of people engaged in the work, in which their framing, their understanding has become more nuanced, their accountability, their recognition of privilege, of trying to deconstruct that, trying to decolonize solidarity as much as they can. It's definitely evolved. So yeah, it's a work in progress, but certainly I think particularly for the younger folks to whom I spoke of, who have been really sort of on the receiving line of a lot of this criminalization, I think that has shifted. And I think for a lot of people on the move, for asylum seekers, for refugees, etc., in these contexts, unfortunately, the context is one of such profound injustice, that sometimes the imperfect offerings of those who try and respond are all that exist. But I think once people get to a place of safety, once people get into a position, of being able to access more rights, that very necessary, critique of what is solidarity, what is asylum seeker, refugee-led, migrant solidarity leadership? What does that look like? How is that actualized? And I think Ireland is a very good example of that, vis-a-vis Massey, that perfect offering that I responded to or referred to is not enough, that we need movements that are accountable, that are led by lived experience, led by those who are making these journeys. But in the immediacy of the crisis, for now, the search and rescue personnel and others responding in the Central Med are unfortunately the only response that exists, for better or for worse.
Thank you, Caoimhe. We have a few, everybody's come alive now. We've got quite a few messages in the chat, but we're not going to have time for them all. But we have one message there, and I'm not going to read out the detail in full, but it's from Ken, and he's doing some research on human rights defenders negatively impacting on the operation of search and rescue, particularly around the Greek islands, and he's looking for help in how he might measure this. So he's saying the answer to his research question is, of course, that it's negatively impacting search and rescue in a huge way, but he'd be particularly interested if anyone has any advice on how he may measure this. So he's basically asked us to pass his email on to you guys. So if that's okay, we'll do that rather than go into detail on that now. And if you can help him out, it's brilliant. There is another question here, actually, that it's an interesting question, I think, and I'm not sure we were able to answer it, but I'll put it out there and maybe put it to you, Aideen. Anthony asks, he was wondering if there is a legal case to be made against the EU policy. Is there a case that it's against international law, and is that a route worth pursuing? Who might pursue that, I suppose?
Thanks, yeah. Well, just to say that, Mariusz, in his first speaking told us about the the legal changes in Poland and this extending of emergency powers. So I think that's very concerning, and the same in Greece and in many other EU member states. What was bad practice is now actually in national legislation. So in September 2021, Greece updated their legislation, making it kind of a crime or punishable for a civil society vessel to rescue without having permission from the Greece Coast Guard. So the fact that they were able to put this into legislation and not just practice shows kind of, I suppose, the weakness of the EU in this area. But lots of people are putting energy into fighting this in the courts. Or fighting different things. So, for example, over the past 2 months, the Greek Council for Refugees and Human Rights 360, when they were notified of pushbacks, they got the European Court of Human Rights to intervene and tell the Greek Coast Guard to go and rescue those people and not push them back. They were on the islet of this river of Evros. So the court has intervened in that way, but quite complex in that the national court has to ask for an opinion from the European Court of Justice, and that's been an obstacle. But yeah, that is being pursued by some people. I suppose we're also thinking that there has to be the political pressure in conjunction with that.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm conscious of time. We're 20 past 8 already, so I think just for our speakers, is there anything else anyone wants to add, or anything else that Aidan and Mariusz wants to add to what Kiva said earlier on about what people can do, how they can show solidarity?
Yeah, well, I think I wanted to echo what Mariusz and Kriva said about local people being the first responders and the backbone. And we've all seen this in Greece, and you've seen it in different places as well, because sometimes that could be overlooked with the people coming from elsewhere. And I think it's really important to focus on that as a way to move away from what more right-wing actors might say of what I was often told in Brussels was Europeans don't want this, Europeans don't want these people. But by focusing on the actions of those responders, we can confront that narrative and say, well, all of these people's actions say otherwise. So I think that's an important thing to do. And then for people based in Ireland, I would say maybe write to your local TDs, as we've been told that that's what really counts, is hearing from constituents, and that's what puts it onto politicians' radars. Yeah, sorry, I'll let somebody else come in.
Mariusz, do you want to add anything to that?
Just to stress again, like what was said before, I'm not that much of a believer in petitions and stuff like that. I wouldn't say that I've been disappointed, but kind of really struggle to see if it's really working. But I also agree that still this kind of things, this work needs to be done. I think in Polish context, people in Ireland can do, I think, more direct action, because Polish government is very kind of sensitive about how they look abroad. And as we speak, there's a hunger strike in closed detention center, and basically like prisons in Poland. You're not even allowed a smartphone there, limited access to internet, people separated from their families, and then being kept there for months, which I'm not an expert. I believe there's also like maximum time you can spend in detention center, and often people are kept longer. And there's now a long hunger strike in Leszno Wola, close to Warsaw. And I think monitoring what is happening in Podlasie region and in Poland, and reacting by pressing on your politicians to talk to their colleagues in European Parliament, or even making a demonstration in front of Polish embassy in Dublin, something that like they know that the world is watching. And the fact that they didn't let journalists and NGOs do so-called closed zone or detention center doesn't mean that the Europe is not seeing what they do. And I think that even writing a letter to the Polish embassy, hey, I know about that you made pushbacks legal in the Polish law, and I'm not happy with that as a European citizen, as a person living in Ireland or elsewhere, and I see you. And I think that would be a great thing for them. So it's just not internal Polish matter. And this could have an impact, because as I said, I believe they're very sensitive about how they look abroad, especially for Western Europe. And they're trying to write on what we did, what Polish people did, like how great the response to our neighbors in Ukraine suffering was. But it wasn't, again, our government doing that. It was just common people responding to them en masse. And they're trying to paint themselves as like a really great humanitarian government. It's the same government that pushes children over the razor fence to oppressors in Belarus. So I think that, in my perspective, like this kind of like pushing on Polish government whenever you can. I'm not talking about Polish citizens, it's a different thing, just to be clear. And another thing, what I really believe that could be done, it's basically going back to people who end up in Polish detention centers. In Poland, we actually do not have like a proper asylum system. It's a lot of things are happening because someone decided you're going to open detention, you're going to close, or you're going to be pushed back to Belarus. It's kind of not. But for those people who ended up in Poland, I'm maybe working on kind of some sponsorship system, at least for the families, so they are not in Poland, because Poland is not a good place for them. And after the trauma and everything, maybe hosting some of them even temporarily somewhere far away from that forest and from Belarus, that would be a good thing. Even one family would make a difference, I think, for that family. I mean.
Thank you, Mariusz. And I can see there's a comment here on it says, in addition to your point, remind the Irish government that if they can respond to Ukrainian refugees, they should respond to asylum seekers already there, particularly facilitating their children to go to school and not be stuck in hotels for months on end.
Totally.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point, you know, that we need to show support and solidarity to everyone seeking refuge and protection and safety. That a polarizing conversation is not helpful. That we need to turn our frustrations towards the systems and structures that are causing these issues in the first place, not to the people themselves, the people that are already suffering. It is 8:25. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. I'm reluctant to let. Is there any last any burning comments or points that you'd like to, any of the panelists would like to make before we hand back over to Aga?
Well, if I could just sorry, Quiva.
No, go on. Go ahead, Aidan. We'll come to it. We give Quiva the last word. Go ahead.
Just on what you said, just there, Niamh, in your response to that comment, Oxfam Ireland have an equal right to refuge campaign. So yeah, that we're doing advocacy work on at the moment, and we have a petition asking Micheál Martin to have this equal right to refuge, so that we avoid a kind of two-tier system. So I'd ask if people are interested that they keep an eye and keep in touch with us as we develop this campaign.
Brilliant, yeah. Thank you, Aidan.
I just say, and I don't want to be the last word, but I just say, because I'm still reflecting on the question from a few paragraphs ago, but I'd say for us all to remember, you know, that we're temporary interlocutors, and I think that human rights struggles in general oftentimes are stymied by interlocutors. You know, people don't need them. I think people on the move have every capacity and every right to be articulating, framing, narrating, their lived experience and their journeys. In the immediacy of now, however, oftentimes people are stuck in these limbos, stuck in these struggles for the most basic of survival, stuck in legal process to try and access their rights. So in this temporary sort of state of trying to bridge some of those lived experiences, I just say to the audiences, or to the audience here, or the participants here, that already, and I've seen this even in sort of the last curve of, the last 7 years since 2014, 2015, so many of the people that I've interacted with over the past years, profoundly, again, brave survivors from a multiplicity of different contexts, are already restoring and sort of subverting, I think, narratives that have been formed around them, ones that play into these dichotomies of either overemphasize resilience or overemphasize vulnerability. And they're doing so, with humor, with great subversive politic, with amazingly creative means. I'm thinking, of the poets and, documentary makers and musicians, and writers, and filmmakers, and all of the other, sort of amazing narration that is coming out of these journeys. So I just be really conscious that the snapshot that we provide into people's lived experience is just that the story is obviously much broader and much longer than that what we're emphasizing on tonight, which is criminalization. And I personally certainly have been really inspired, just to see, and I'm not talking about bravery here, but yeah, just the profound narrative reframing that is going on by people who survive this. And I think that is as instructive as the migrant-led leadership on an advocacy level that I referred to, that we all refer to as well. And to thank all the participants, because I'm really conscious that there's loads of folks with us tonight who are engaged in this work. So yeah, just energy and all power to you all in all the different ways that you're bearing witness. Yay. Keep on keeping on, all of us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Caoimhe. And thank you very much, Mariusz and Aideen and Caoimhe, for being here this evening. To our audience, thanks very much. But for me, I've really enjoyed this evening. I thank you very much for your time and for sharing your experiences so openly. And it's been a pleasure and a privilege for me. And I wish you all safety and respect in your future work. And over to you, Aga.
Yes, I'm still under impression of all your great work, and I think I just would like to thank you for what you are doing, and to finish on a positive note in a very, I think, difficult times for all of us, and in a very kind of heavy topic that we are discussing today. I just would like to finish on a positive note that it's like people like you, I think, give all of us hope. That it's not only doom and gloom, and people who are here tonight with us, I would like to thank you as well for being here and for being active and for listening to this conversation. And please talk to your peers, talk to your colleagues, talk to your friends, because the more people know about it, the more people, people will be moved, because, your circles of that you have, you can influence them. So don't be silent, and, talk about it, educate yourself, participate in our events, support the Oxfam's campaign, write to Polish embassy. They are here, and, I'm Polish myself, and, I've been on the Ukrainian protests when they were saying that, they are all amazing on the borders, but they just forgot to mention what's happening on the Belarusian border at the same time when they were helping Ukrainian refugees. And by no means, we also have to remember to stay in solidarity with all refugees against, and we must remember not to put one group of refugees against another group, because all of them need our support, and all of them are suffering, all of them are hurt. So I just would like to finish with the message of solidarity with Ukrainians and those in the Mediterranean, those in states, in the South America, and all people who are seeking refuge and safety. And, we are just lucky that we live where we live. And I hope that, your spirits are still high and you don't give up hope. and we'll be in touch with the messages from and links and information from our speakers next week. Thank you very much, and please share this video if you can once it's live. Thank you very much for our speakers. Thank you very much, Niamh, and thank you very much to Saif, who was in the background dealing with your messages. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night, folks.
Bye.
Thanks. Thanks, Million. Good night.